In late 2022, as whispers of impending US sanctions began circling through diplomatic and financial channels, something strange happened inside Prince Group. Overnight, vast amounts of capital, billions of dollars, began quietly moving out of Cambodia. Offshore subsidiaries were dissolved, real estate holdings were transferred to shell companies in Hong Kong, Macau, and the British Virgin Islands. Even internal accounts at Prince Bank showed massive withdrawals disguised as infrastructure repayments. And at the center of it all stood one man, Chen Zhi, Cambodia's most powerful yet most elusive billionaire. By the time the US Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, announced its sanctions list months later, Chen's fortune had already vanished from Cambodian soil. What stunned investigators was the precision of the timing. Every transfer, every closure, every offshore filing completed days before the official announcement. It was as if someone had handed him a copy of the sanctions notice long before it became public. How could he have known? Who warned him? And where did the money go? This wasn't just a financial escape, it was an operation, an extraction that involved crypto exchanges, international lawyers, and front companies across 3 continents. What began as a sudden capital flight soon looked like a strategic retreat, one that shielded billions while leaving behind a hollow empire still operating under his name. Because in Chen Zhi's world, disappearance isn't defeat, it's preparation. In the months leading up to the US sanctions, Cambodia looked calm on the surface. The towers of Prince Group still glittered in the Phnom Penh skyline, its advertisements still promised prosperity, and Chen Zhi's philanthropic foundation continued its carefully choreographed donations to hospitals and universities. But beneath the polished facade, the empire was already in motion. Reports from international compliance analysts hinted at suspicious transfers from Prince-linked accounts as early as October 2022, long before any public mention of penalties. Those who knew how Chen operated understood one thing: he always moved first. At that time, rumors about money laundering networks tied to Cambodia's elite were circulating among financial watchdogs. The Financial Action Task Force, FATF, had already placed the country on its grey list due to weak oversight, and intelligence officers from the US, Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, had quietly begun tracing irregular transactions linked to casinos, real estate, and shell companies. Many of those companies, it turned out, shared direct or indirect ties to Prince Group's subsidiaries. Yet inside Cambodia, no one dared to question the group's legitimacy. Chen Zhi's relationship with senior government officials made him nearly untouchable. His company sponsored national events, donated to state-led charity drives, and publicly aligned itself with the Prime Minister's economic agenda. He had become, in effect, a pillar of Cambodia's national image, a symbol of prosperity built on Chinese investment. The illusion was perfect. While foreign media speculated about corruption, the local press praised Prince Group as the future of Cambodia's private sector. But the real story was unfolding quietly in financial backrooms and offshore servers. Around December 2022, Prince executives began attending a series of urgent financial compliance meetings in Phnom Penh and Singapore. Officially, they were discussing risk mitigation amid global market instability. Unofficially, they were preparing for impact. A small circle of trusted advisors, including lawyers from Hong Kong, compliance experts from Singapore, and private bankers from Macau, were tasked with one goal: to dismantle Chen Zhi's visible financial network before Washington's sanctions could freeze it. The strategy was simple but audacious. Prince's major Cambodian holdings were to be transferred or sold to front companies owned by foreign nationals, effectively removing Chen's name from direct ownership records. Meanwhile, hundreds of millions in project funding were to be rerouted through Macau finance intermediaries to offshore accounts in the British Virgin Islands. Those funds would then be converted into cryptocurrency assets to obscure their origin. Still, there were signs of anxiety even within his inner circle. Several mid-level executives resigned suddenly in early 2023, citing family reasons. Others were transferred abroad under unclear assignments, but the empire kept functioning. Every hotel still lit its sign, every bank still opened its doors. To the outside world, nothing had changed. What no one saw was that Chen Zhi had already begun hollowing out his empire from the inside. The buildings, businesses, and charity banners were still there, but the money, the power, and the leverage had quietly slipped away. It was the calm before the storm, and when the storm came, Prince Group would still be standing, but empty. The first clues of Chen Zhi's billion-dollar escape appeared not in Cambodia, but in Hong Kong, where corporate filings suddenly began to shift. Between January and March 2023, at least a dozen offshore entities linked to Prince Group either changed ownership, updated directors, or declared dormant status, a classic sign of pre-sanction restructuring. Each change coincided with suspicious money flows through private banking corridors in Singapore, Macau, and the British Virgin Islands. It was the anatomy of an extraction, not chaotic, but meticulously timed. The transfers began small, a few $1 million labeled as consulting fees or foreign development investments. But by mid-February, those payments had ballooned into 9-digit transactions, many routed through Macau's Industrial Bank of China and a network of holding firms with nearly identical names: Prince Asia Holdings, Prince Capital Global, Asia Prince Investment Limited. The purpose, according to leaked internal correspondence, was risk diversification. In reality, the network was designed to strip Chen's financial empire of traceability. One of the most sophisticated maneuvers involved Prince Bank, Chen's own institution. Instead of transferring funds directly, the bank issued a series of infrastructure prepayments to shell construction firms registered in Kampot and Prea Sihanouk. Those companies then paid suppliers abroad, many of whom existed only on paper. Within days, the money reappeared in offshore accounts under unrelated subsidiaries in Hong Kong. It was a laundering pattern wrapped in the language of legitimate commerce. The extraction wasn't limited to traditional banking. Chen's network exploited the crypto corridor that connected Southeast Asia to the Middle East. Investigators later traced transactions through exchanges based in Dubai, Malaysia, and Thailand, where large volumes of USDT, Tether, and Bitcoin were exchanged for fiat currency via unregulated over-the-counter desks. By converting billions into digital assets, Chen effectively placed his fortune beyond the immediate reach of Western regulators. Meanwhile, lawyers in Singapore worked around the clock to finalize a cascade of asset transfers disguised as divestments. Real estate holdings in Phnom Penh's Diamond Island, the Prince Central Plaza, and multiple seaside properties in Sihanoukville were suddenly sold to foreign investors. Individuals later revealed to be employees of intermediary firms tied to Chen's offshore network. These fake sales provided plausible deniability. When sanctions came, his companies would appear compliant, stripped of his direct ownership. The speed of these movements astonished experts. It takes months for a multinational to reorganize, yet Chen's empire shifted billions in weeks. Such coordination hinted at advance warning, perhaps from advisors linked to Beijing's financial intelligence network or insiders within Cambodia's government. Whatever the source, the precision was chilling. Even after the exodus, traces of the transfers lingered. Leaked SWIFT transaction logs reviewed by journalists showed identical timestamps for transfers across 4 jurisdictions, a pattern only possible through synchronized automation. Each transaction was executed in under 60 seconds, routed through Macau, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the BVI. It wasn't just an exit, it was a systematic erasure. By the time OFAC released its sanctions in April, the empire was already hollow. The buildings stood, the brand remained, but the money, the real power, had vanished beyond reach. Cambodia's financial regulators issued no inquiry. Local newspapers reported that Prince Group continues operations as usual, but insiders knew better. Chen Zhi had pulled off the impossible. He had moved billions out of a sanctioned zone before the sanctions even existed. It was the perfect crime of timing, and it raised one question that haunted every investigator afterward. Who told him it was coming? The fact that Chen Zhi had evacuated his empire so efficiently suggested more than just intuition. It suggested information. Someone, somewhere, had tipped him off. The coordination across borders, the legal precision, and the calm execution pointed to one chilling reality. Chen Zhi wasn't just a billionaire businessman. He was deeply embedded in a network of intelligence, diplomacy, and financial insiders that ensured he always stayed one step ahead. Multiple sources across Hong Kong, Singapore, and Phnom Penh later confirmed that Chen's legal and financial advisors had long-standing relationships with figures tied to China's state-owned enterprises, SOEs, particularly CITIC Group and China Harbour Engineering, both of which have documented connections to Beijing's civil-military fusion framework. These conglomerates don't just build roads and ports, they also provide cover for strategic operations, including the flow of sensitive information. According to internal correspondence leaked from a Singapore-based law firm in mid-2023, one of Chen's legal representatives had received regulatory intelligence updates from a consultant with ties to Chinese diplomatic channels weeks before the US Treasury issued its announcement. These so-called updates were vague, references to foreign asset review risks and heightened scrutiny for politically exposed entities. But for someone like Chen, they were enough. He didn't need details, he needed timing. The first signal came through private bankers in Hong Kong, where compliance teams began quietly flagging accounts tied to Prince-linked shell companies. These warnings, normally internal, somehow reached Chen's financial managers in Phnom Penh within days. Soon after, emails circulated instructing department heads to prepare non-critical divestments. Then came the second signal, more direct and impossible to ignore. A senior financial advisor who previously consulted for China Minsheng Bank reportedly contacted one of Chen's trusted intermediaries, warning that a Western jurisdiction is preparing an adverse action against a high-profile individual operating in Cambodia. That message, transmitted through an encrypted channel, set everything into motion. From that point, Chen's empire began its silent retreat. Every department had a coded protocol. In Prince Bank's internal system, for example, transactions marked Class C priority indicated immediate clearance regardless of verification. Between February and March 2023, dozens of such entries appeared, each representing a transfer of at least 20 million USD. While Chen's own communications remained encrypted and largely unreachable, fragments of metadata later analyzed by cybersecurity experts revealed connections to Beijing-based IP clusters known to be used by China's Ministry of State Security, MSS, proxies. The implication was explosive. Chen Zhi's network might have been operating not just under corporate guidance, but under state protection. Western intelligence analysts believe the United Front Work Department, UFWD, also played a supporting role. The UFWD's mandate to cultivate influence through diaspora networks and overseas businessmen made Chen Zhi the perfect asset. Through this framework, it's likely that Beijing's regional liaisons passed along diplomatic whispers that allowed him to move before Washington's sanctions hit. Adding to the intrigue was the involvement of London-based legal consultants specializing in asset restructuring for politically exposed clients. One consultant later admitted under anonymity that Chen's offshore transfers were too synchronized to be coincidental. They had seen the same methods used in Russian oligarch escapes prior to sanctions, warning signals delivered through discrete financial channels long before public announcements. By the time OFAC's internal deliberations leaked to journalists, Chen's assets were already dispersed across 7 jurisdictions, his ownership diluted through dozens of intermediaries, and his companies legally shielded by layers of corporate fog. It was as though he had read the playbook before it was written. Some insiders described Chen as a man who doesn't react, he anticipates. Others were blunter. He doesn't run from storms, he moves before the clouds form. Whatever the source of his warnings, one thing became clear. Chen Zhi was not alone. He was part of a larger protection architecture, one that blurred the line between diplomacy, intelligence, and finance. And that network had just pulled off one of the cleanest pre-sanction evacuations in modern history. When the dust settled in Cambodia, Chen Zhi's name had all but disappeared from the companies he once owned. But the money hadn't vanished. It had simply changed its address. Within weeks of the US sanctions announcement, billions of dollars in assets began surfacing under new jurisdictions far from Phnom Penh. Investigators tracing these flows soon discovered that Chen's fortune had been reborn in the world's most secretive financial havens, from the gleaming towers of Dubai to the tax shelters of Cyprus and the labyrinthine corporate webs of the Cayman Islands. Each move followed a familiar pattern used by powerful figures avoiding Western scrutiny: divide, disguise, and redeploy. A private jet registered in Macau made repeated trips to Dubai's Al Maktoum International Airport, carrying not goods or passengers, but documents, contracts, title deeds, and digital storage devices encrypted with offshore account data. Those same weeks, corporate registries in Cyprus recorded a wave of new incorporations tied to entities with eerily familiar names: Prince International Holdings Limited, East Ocean Capital FZE, Azure Development Limited. Their directors were obscure consultants, many based in Hong Kong and the UAE, and their business purposes were listed as property management or asset advisory. Behind the facade, these firms functioned as financial laundromats, designed to cleanse Chen's Cambodian wealth by routing it through multiple layers of reinvestment. Real estate assets once held under Prince Group subsidiaries were sold on paper to these new offshore firms, then immediately leased back to Cambodian partners. The result? Chen retained control of the properties, but his name and legal liability vanished from ownership records. One of the most sophisticated mechanisms involved cryptocurrency conversion and reinvestment. Using middlemen in Malaysia and Dubai, Chen's team liquidated large holdings in Tether, USDT, and Bitcoin, then reinvested the proceeds into venture capital funds registered in Singapore and Abu Dhabi Global Market, ADGM. These funds, in turn, purchased shares in seemingly legitimate fintech and logistics startups, effectively burying the origin of Chen's capital under layers of new investments. According to one leaked audit from a European compliance firm, at least $1.7 billion was reintroduced into Asia through this process between May and September 2023. The movement was subtle. No large transfers, no sudden activity spikes. Instead, it was a stream of steady inflows, perfectly calibrated to avoid detection thresholds. It was like watching someone dismantle a palace brick by brick, one investigator later said. By the time we noticed, the entire structure was standing somewhere else. But perhaps the boldest part of the operation was Chen's entry into Dubai's golden visa ecosystem. In late 2023, a company called Aurora Capital Middle East quietly appeared in the UAE corporate database. Its registered owner, a Cambodian national with no prior business history, later identified as one of Chen's personal assistants. Within 3 months, Aurora Capital had acquired prime real estate in Business Bay and Jumeirah Lake Towers, valued at over $400 million. Analysts believe this was Chen's new command base, where his empire could operate under looser financial regulations and out of reach of Western sanctions. This strategy, old tricks in new havens, worked because the global system still favors money over accountability. Each jurisdiction offered just enough opacity to keep investigators guessing and regulators powerless. By early 2024, Chen Zhi's official empire in Cambodia looked fragile, but outside the country, his offshore shadow network was thriving. It was no longer about escaping sanctions, it was about evolving past them. And as one regional analyst put it, he didn't hide his money, he moved the world around it. When the US Treasury finally unveiled its sanctions list, Cambodia's financial elite held their breath. The world expected chaos, frozen accounts, shuttered companies, collapsing investments. But none of that happened. Prince Group remained open. Its hotels continued welcoming guests, its bank processed transactions as usual, and construction cranes still towered over Phnom Penh. To the untrained eye, nothing had changed, yet for those watching closely, the silence was revealing. Chen Zhi's escape had worked. Behind the polished facade, however, the damage was deeper than anyone realized. Within days of the sanctions, Western investors quietly withdrew from joint projects, fearing secondary exposure. Real estate developers from Europe and Australia cancelled partnerships. Even Japanese banks suspended credit lines. Though the Cambodian government publicly defended Prince Group as a national asset, internal documents showed a rapid loss of liquidity. Revenue reports began showing shortfalls as early as May 2023, forcing the conglomerate to liquidate smaller subsidiaries to maintain the illusion of stability. Meanwhile, inside Cambodia's government, cracks began to form. Officials who had once benefited from Chen's philanthropy now found themselves under international scrutiny. Western embassies began questioning development deals linked to Chinese capital. Several mid-level bureaucrats responsible for approving Prince projects were quietly reassigned, an unofficial acknowledgement that something had gone wrong. But no one dared say Chen Zhi's name publicly. It was as if mentioning him could bring diplomatic consequences. For Beijing, the fallout was equally complex. On one hand, Chen's disappearance removed a valuable economic intermediary who had once helped funnel Chinese investment through Cambodia. On the other hand, it served as a lesson in adaptability. His successful pre-sanction evacuation proved how effectively China's financial shielding network could protect its overseas operators. State-linked media outlets remained silent, but internal policy memos circulated among Chinese investment circles praised the discipline and foresight of Prince Group's restructuring, a euphemism for its flight. The real casualties were the smaller partners, the contractors, accountants, and mid-level investors who lacked the offshore lifeboats Chen had built. Many lost everything when the group quietly restructured ownership. Some were left holding worthless equity in companies that no longer existed. Others faced questioning from financial authorities, accused of facilitating transactions they didn't understand. Internationally, the US Treasury's enforcement looked hollow. Officials had moved too late. The sanctions were supposed to cripple Chen's empire. Instead, they merely documented its transformation. Analysts within the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, described it as a blueprint for evasion. One report even noted that the Prince case could become a training model for future investigations, illustrating how the global elite anticipate sanctions and preempt them through digital finance and offshore layering. By the end of 2024, Cambodia's economy had recovered superficially, but its credibility had not. Western investors grew wary of its banking system, fearing hidden exposure to sanctioned entities. In Phnom Penh, the once proud Prince Central Plaza became a symbol of unanswered questions, an architectural reminder that money, when paired with intelligence and protection, can always outrun accountability. And as for Chen Zhi, no one could confirm his whereabouts. Some reports placed him in Dubai, others in Macau under a different identity. None were verified. Yet his companies continued to operate under new directors. His logos remained untouched, and his foundation even resumed donations under a rebranded name. He was gone, but not gone. Punished, but untouchable. Because in the end, the greatest fallout wasn't financial, it was philosophical. Chen Zhi had proven that in the global game of power and capital, disappearance is not an end, it's an upgrade. In the world of global finance, vanishing is an art form, and Chen Zhi perfected it. What began as whispers of corruption and pending sanctions ended with a billionaire walking off the map, his empire intact, his fortune invisible, his name erased from every ledger that mattered. He didn't run from justice, he ran ahead of it. While regulators in Washington celebrated their crackdown, Chen was already rebuilding elsewhere, a ghost in the system, operating behind layers of offshore trusts, crypto transactions, and legal proxies. His story wasn't about money alone, it was about anticipation, access, and protection. He knew the rules of power better than those who tried to enforce them. Today, his towers in Phnom Penh still gleam under the sun, his brand continues to fund charity, and his network hums quietly in the background, untraceable but omnipresent. The sanctions, in hindsight, look less like punishment and more like confirmation, proof that Chen Zhi had become too big to catch. Some say he's living in Dubai, others claim he's reinvented himself in Macau under a new identity. But perhaps it doesn't matter. The man himself may have disappeared, yet his system endures, replicated by others who learned from his playbook. Because in the age of digital wealth and political immunity, the smartest escape is not to hide, but to remain visible, untouchable, and just out of reach.